And we're back. Once again, let me tell you that your essays are so well done. I'm enjoying them enormously, and I think you're enjoying remarking on each other's essays because you're doing a nice job of being very honest on them, and you're willing to say, this could have been this way, or I disagree with what you said. So that's great because that's what this has to be, is a sharing of ideas. And in your comments, you are willing to share ideas. So you're doing a terrific job. Okay. Um, I had to laugh because your essays are due at noon on Saturday, and one person's essay was posted at 11:59 a.m. So I really thought that was fun. Feel free to post your essays as early in the week as you want to as well. Okay, you don't have to wait till the weekend. If you want to get started on that earlier, that's fine. Okay, now moving along. This week we are moving on to the concept of the narrator in literature. Okay, let me make it very clear to you right away that the narrator and the author are not the same. The narrator is a created character who tells us the story. He is the voice in the story coming to us. The author is the person who writes the story. We are often led to confusion in these things, but keep in mind the person telling us the story is not the author. The person who tells us the story is the narrator. Okay? Now, why is this important? Authors create narrators. Authors have narrators giving us the story, giving us the message, so that stories are not actually being told to us directly by the author. The author has created the narrator. Okay, that's how we hear stories, and this has different kinds of effects for us as readers. Okay, we'll talk about different kinds of narrators, but if we get a story that is given to us from the point of view of I, me, I, or we, it helps us become one with the story. We get drawn in more. On the other hand, if the story comes to us as he, she, it, they, Joe, Tom, whoever, and the narrator is just telling us a story about other people, then we become more of an observer. Okay? So it's important for you to understand right away the narrator is not the author is not the narrator. Okay? Edgar Allan Poe was such a terrific writer that the narrators that he created made people think that he was the narrator when in fact his narrators were created characters. So there's the general idea that Edgar Allan Poe was a drunk and a drug addict and a rake and all this kind of stuff. And he was actually a very boring guy who lived a boring life. All of these things were invented because the critics didn't like him, because he would write critiques of his own work, and so he was taking away their job. As a result, they wrote terrible things about him, making it seem that he was the narrator, that he personally, the author, was the narrator in his works. So, even among literary people, there are often bits of confusion with this. Okay, so let me first of all say that there are two general kinds of narrators. There is a third person narrator and a first person narrator. A third person narrator tells us the story from the point of view of kind of looking down on it, seeing it from someplace else, and telling us what the action is going to be about. So the narrator will tell us about, Mary Smith and and Joe Jones and whatever names the characters might have, but the narrator is not involved in the story. The third person narrator is a viewer who is telling us about the story. Much of literature is written this way. And again, there's a reason for an author to do that. There are times when the author wants us to have a little bit of a removed view so that we don't get any, so that there is less, maybe, of what might come across as the narrator's influence in the story, but rather just telling us a story. Okay? So, third person narrator we've seen already in, for instance, the story of an hour. Okay, the narrator was totally removed from that story. The narrator just told us what happened, told us about Mrs. Mallard and Brent Mallard and Mrs. Mallard's sister who was at the house, these kinds of things. But the narrator was not at all part of the story. Okay, so that's a third-person narrator, somebody who is kind of viewing it from afar and telling us what's going on. Another kind of narrator we'll see is a first-person narrator. First person means I or we or us, them. Okay, and a first-person narrator is frequently, not always, but frequently involved in the action of the story. There are different kinds of first-person narrators. We'll see a story this week where the first-person narrator is intricately involved in the story. Much of the story is about the first-person narrator. That's not the author. That's a created character by the narrator. But it comes to us from the point of view of I. Okay? And within the scope of the first-person narrator, we can also have an all-knowing narrator. So a narrator who is part of it and is considered omniscient, telling us all of the details, knowing everything that's going to happen. It's a narrator who is involved in the story, is part of the story. We'll say I or we, referring to himself, the narrator. And again, he may well be a character in the story. And then we have the semi-omniscient narrator. Omniscient means all-knowing. So an omniscient narrator knows everything, and so he tells us everything from an all-knowing point of view. The limited omniscient narrator or semi-omniscient narrator is a narrator who knows most stuff, but not everything. Let me give you a quick example of an omniscient narrator. In A Rose for Emily, that story was told to us as if the townspeople who were there were telling us the story. And we got that story about Miss Emily from the point of view of we. If you look back at the story, you'll see parts where it is said, we thought, and we did, and we watched, So it was somebody who was, in a sense, semi-involved, telling us the story a little bit from inside, but didn't know everything. Obviously, that limited or semi-omniscient narrator didn't know everything because that limited omniscient narrator did not know that there was a dead body in Miss Emily's bed. Okay, so that's a limited omniscient narrator. So the omniscient narrator knows everything and talks to us from the point of view of I. The limited omniscient narrator knows a lot, okay, but doesn't tell us everything. Okay, so we have a first-person narrator and a third-person narrator. Now, in one of the stories that we'll read for this week, there is some conversation that goes on. So there is some individuals. There are some individuals who speak from the point of view of I. But that's not the narrator. That's only a character in the story who is speaking from the point of view of I. So that does not make the story first-person narration. We have some first-person conversation as characters talk to each other, but that's not the person telling the story. Okay? So that is not first-person narration because the narrator is the person who tells us the story. So don't confuse dialogue with narration. Okay? So again, first-person narrator, third-person narrator. First person, I, we, us. Third person, names, people's names, and he, she, it, they, okay, them. Okay, so keep those ideas straight. Your question for this week is this. Give me a quick one-sentence opinion of the grandmother in A Good Man is Hard to Find. Have a good week.